Welcome, everybody. The first ever Global Apex at Home event continues. My name is Vlad Uvarov, and I'm the development manager on the Oracle Apex development team in Western Virginia, which is also known as Oracle Apex Global Headquarters. It is my pleasure to introduce your next speaker. He's a frequent Apex presenter with a diverse background in integration technologies. With a primary focus on building value with diverse teams, he continues to promote Apex as high-value solution in the aerospace industry. Please welcome, from Charlotte, North Carolina, and formerly a member of the Apex development team, Tim Hilaire. Tim?
Thank you very much, Vlad. We're going to spend a little time today. We are the 19th hour, I believe, of the 24-hour run-through, which is just fabulous. It has been playing in my background for the majority of the day, and I keep having to stop my work and figure out what it is, the new thing that people have been talking about, because it is just very good content. For those of you who are curious, my understanding is all the sessions are recorded and will be available for replay later. So no one is expected to try to sleep deprive themselves to catch all of the sessions. All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about some mail features and relative to Application Express. And in honor of the fine work that's been going on with relative to dark mode, I will turn down your screen brightnesses just for a little bit in trying to save your eyes. It is something that I've gotten very accustomed to recently, and we will be talking a little bit about how it is relevant to email generation. For the topics that I'm going to cover, it seems like a very simple topic, but it's going to get very complicated very quickly. So I'm going to start off with the declarative process of how the Apex Mail works within the tool. We're going to talk about declarative. We're going to talk about how the API works. We're going to talk very much about an underrated feature of Apex Mail, which is the shared templates for your application development. We're going to go into some client format and considerations, and we're kind of going to veer a little bit away from Apex to talk more about considerations for how you generate email and the topic itself. Then we're going to break it into architects and administrators from things that have to be considered before you start sending email, how that impacts what you're going to be seeing at the customer level, at your end, spam considerations, things that you're going to want to know when you start sending things outside, some considerations for software development, and finish up with some references and other thoughts for you to take away from the talk. A lot of these topics that I'm going to be talking about are referenced via links, whether they be blog posts or otherwise, so they can lead to further reading. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's start off with the simple stuff. How do you send email in Apex? Well, if you're new to Apex, this is probably something that you've asked or been looking into. And the basic 101 is, for an Apex process, they have a template-driven wizard that allows this to happen super easy. So on your page, you would have a process that is kicked off by some event, a click of a button, something like this, reads in some regular data, whether they be variables or whether they be static is up to you. And you can use that information to generate an email that automatically happens with your proper setup of Apex through the Apex Mail API. Whether you realize it or not, this is basically a parameter-driven wrapper for the Apex API. So this is your first step in how to send an email. One note I do want to mention here with new users that might actually be a bit foreign to you is the fact that they're using the ampersand dot syntax. And that's a PLSQL substitution syntax, and therefore not using the colon bind variables. In your messages, you can use, so in this example here, I basically had a text block that I popped into one individual value. You can have both the text and the HTML body message. You can have values in the subject and your email header up here. Individual attachments, SQL attachments, is a bit more of a complex topic. We'll leave that aside for right now, but it is capable of doing this. You'll notice down at the bottom, the send immediately button basically says to send the push queue immediately, or whether or not to do it in a batch mode. Normally in your Apex installation, Apex Mail queue is purged every period of time. I believe it's 5 minutes, but you can check on your particular installation for that value can be adjusted. And that way, If you say send it immediately, all of the messages in queue are done as soon as the process is run. So there's the simplest way to send email with the shortest intention. But as you can imagine, this has to actually be run on a page process, has to be run on a button press, which means it's very event driven on an active page. Most things in Apex sometimes happen in batches or can happen in autonomous transactions in the back. So let's talk about the next level of complexity. There's an API package which Apex has provided. They've done a lot of the heavy lifting around the SMTP details and have given you just the important parameters to fill in to send an API message using the framework. This is a construct that has been used widely and is the same form that's called in the previous thing that we were looking at. It's just not driven into things in a form window with all the boxes. In this case, you're actually doing a PLSQL call that you would actually write in this fashion. Here's your API definition. I just put up here for notes. This is the same example that I used before. The trick here is that in this message body, you're actually having to write this out. And if you're going to send out a body in the form of text, but then also send it out in HTML, you have to write two structures, or as I did here, I simply put a header above the one and put a paragraph marker around the second, and the same type of substitutions I did previously. And there's your Apex mail push queue. Link to documentation for future reference. Something to consider here that I put in the notes is to know that if you're going to run this in a PLSQL package, but you're going to have that package be called outside of an Apex page process, you're going to want to know that you're going to need to set session, your security group in your session, your PLSQL session, in order to have that execute. This the construct behind Apex actually keeps track of information at the workspace level. For multiple workspaces, you have to have it tagged to an individual workspace so that you can actually keep the logs separate, the data separate for multi-tenancy purposes. So from that standpoint, just understand if you're running it from PLSQL by itself, it can do that. It's just you need to make sure you get across that hurdle. Again, this assumes a properly set up instance that has all your wallet structures and all your SMTP hosts set up that you will be leveraging as a developer. There's a special feature that's actually built into Sense 18.1 that makes some of this email generation a lot simpler and allows you to separate it from not only your package code, but put it into a designer's hands to say, hey, we want to message. You go figure out what the message is going to be. Put little variables with the little hashtags around them to where you'd want them to be. And you can turn that into a template that can then be revisioned on its own merit and still included in the application the same. This is under every application since 18.1, under shared components, under this other components called email templates. How this works is it uses the same mail API, but with additional values. Instead of having a body reference, it uses this template static ID. And this is your reference to say, hey, here's the content that I want. This is the framework of my message. And then it has this additional feature. Instead of using bind variables that you have to construct the message by itself, you use these bind variables in this format of this placeholders collection in a JSON structure. What this does is allows you to reference that template, substitute values, and send it out. Now, I mentioned the little hashtags. This is how it does substitution values. It uses a # or hash, some type of value, and another hash. So in this case, for my example here, mail from is just in my message surrounded by hash values. So this is the same type of structure that the HTML templates use in Apex. This is my favorite piece, is this template generation API. So this piece of code here, I didn't write. When I built my message and I put the individual values, the hashtags in the to, from, and the body, at the bottom of the mail templates, it generated this for me and said, this is the basic starting blocks for your message. So then I could fill in my page to from, my page to and body. That's actually all I had to do was fill this part in This part was read automatically based on my template. If I had put extra values in here, this would grow and have the extra value in here. Again, it was dynamically created based on the content that was actually used. Found this extremely useful for being able to generate what I would call dynamic output that we could put into a template, have it broken into structures, and work very well. So documentation link here. Oh, one of the things that I'm going to show you, oops, I lost my page, we'll talk a little bit more about the message content. Yeah, it skipped on me. This is what the template looks like from the shared components. So you'll see there's a header, body, footer, and there's very long, and I'm not going to go into demos in this one. You'll see there's identification. There's an advanced section under there, which actually gets to put in your HTML templates with all the breakdown. This is your major content, which is your rows and your values that make up the message body. There's an HTML content around it that does your layout. One of my favorite features is this piece right here. They've loaded it with sample templates, and the sample templates are pre-done layouts that get you 80%, 90% of the way there for some very basic types of emails. So from a business standpoint, this is a great starting point, especially if you're trying to learn this information and learn how this works. Click on this, replaces the content, puts some basic variables in, make adjustments to what you want it to be. Just a fabulous feature. Both HTML plain and or HTML and plain text are in here. And then there's your sample API. You click on this and you'll get that code generation piece that generates this block. So very quickly, you've gotten to the point where, hey, I've done a self-guided form where I can put in a few lines of text without having any issue, to having a very professional looking email with bind variables that you can fill in based on the data that you need. So the next question you get into is, what am I going to put on this email? What am I going to put in it? So let me give you some guidelines. And this isn't anything specifically technology based. This is business based. All right. So if you compare a lot of your email design and your businesses that have actually made your business has made a business of it, that basically are in charge of trying to send out mass emails that you get from Best Buy, that you get from whatever your local retailer is trying to convince you to come in and buy things. That commercial point of view, there's some very basic structures that it's trying to get you to do. It's trying to be visually appealing. It's trying to catch your attention. It's trying to have some type of call to action that you're going to be able to follow up on. It's going to have, hey, buy my stuff at the end of the day. Get your attention in order to keep you engaged with their product. From a business point of view, originally I was under the impression, at least when I approached this type of topic, that, well, business emails are different. But they're really not. You could argue that from a business standpoint, the catches attention really isn't there because it's a work email. You're going to have their attention because it's from work. But the rest of it is still there. You still want it to have it, maybe not visually appealing, like distractingly appealing, but professional. It needs to look like it's not coming from half of a system, that you know what you're doing. Clear call to action. Why are you getting this email? Be brief and be clear. Have enough information on that message to where somebody can actually decide what it is you're actually communicating them about. Now, if you're sending out a report that's just going to have a dump of data that you're using either the attachments feature or something else, simply let them know, hey, this is an attachments feature. But this is something that I put a note on the bottom. I personally have a pet peeve about is, if I'm going to get an email from an automated system, I really want to know where it's coming from, why I'm getting it, and then if there's something wrong or some reason why I'm not supposed to be getting some nameless, faceless email, I want to know who to contact and how to reference it. And in my current position, we have a whole bunch of emails that are sent out, and it's not always clear where they're coming from. And it makes it difficult to know how to respond to them in priority order, or whether or not you can safely ignore them if their actual source is unclear. So there's my little personal takeaway, and it's not a black and white answer as much as make sure that your audience is well informed, especially if you're going to take up their time with emails. So let's talk about how we can do some of these goals with the template structure that we've been dealing with. So the template substitution, if you want to put content into your newly discovered Apex shared templates, you're going to want to know how some of this mechanic works, because otherwise it's going to come out not looking quite so professional. So this snippet here is right out of the Oracle documentation, and on the left is two examples, which I'm going to show you. The one on the first one here we're talking about is the plain text message body. So this assumes, now it's harder these days to find mail clients that are just plain text, but it does happen depending on how they're going about it. Most will show full HTML, but in the case that it just shows plain text, you want to know this mechanic is here. For security reasons, they basically went in and said for each one of these little hashtag enclosed name values, everything's going to be escaped by default unless you tell it specifically otherwise. Now, why would they do this? This is a security reason. If you've been in some of the security talks previously, you'll know that being able to inject different types of HTML that could be harmful, or even JavaScript, is a real concern. So in this case, you want to make sure that you understand when you substitute values into your message, is it going to be something that is a known clean value, or if it has risk from somebody entering it by hand, say you had a comments form or something like that, you might not want to have it include HTML because you're going to be getting then something that somebody could have sent in from outside. So there's the security reason behind it. But the behavior that you're looking for is this. The basic value, when I say basic, which is just this hashtag enclosed variable, will escape out and show any HTML in a text message. The raw value, meaning you've used this construct here, which is the exclamation point raw, still enclosed by the H, text is substituted as is. So in this case, from a basic text message, it's going to look exactly the same, right? Escaped out values, right? Full HTML written. But in the third one, which is the stripped HTML, when you use that same name value with an exclamation point strip HTML, this is telling the API, when you're doing those substitutions, please go ahead and run a regular expression that goes through and finds opening and closing tags and make those all go away. So in this message body section here, because I actually wrote the same message that has the same variable 3 times, just one like this, one like this, one like this. And you'll see it says go to Google, but it has no link around it. So in plain text message, this really doesn't mean much, but this is an example of what's going to happen if HTML is included with your substitution value. So now let's go to the next page. This is a HTML display of the same information. So this is in the same template where I use the same values of name. And in this case, for the HTML, you'll see this is header 1. It shows the escaped values out because given this structure automatically escapes based on the context, you're going to still see the reference href tag here. In the raw form, text is substituted as is. This was in my message, which was this href. It actually comes out as a link and shows with the underscore. So this is a clickable link now using this same HTML as opposed to the previous one. This one here that says strip HTML behaves just like it did in text, which is it just shows the stuff between the proper open and close tags. So this is something to be aware of when you're using the templates. It's a great feature that you're allowed to inject things in, but please understand your content and also its source of where it's coming from. You don't want to open your email open to somebody saying, hey, please submit feedback, and they inject some type of JavaScript that's going to start stealing your cookies or something like this, or redirect you to a inappropriate location. So let's talk a little bit about how to create one of these templates. This is the advanced tab I was telling you about previously. There is, for those of you who've been studying CSS, two sessions back, advanced CSS for the layouts and all this other wonderfulness. It's great. But what you're going to find is that the rule of thumb for email is old school layouts. So early Apex, HTMLDB, early versions of Apex, layouts were table-based. And that is kind of the mode that you have to be in when dealing with email. It's like the old browser wars, except for there's a lot more clients. And they have a lot less forgiveness and a lot more form factors if you figure phones and all the different sizes that they come in, as well as the different versions of different email clients. They're going to have HTML written in table format. And this right here is one of the examples that was provided by Oracle, built into the tool. You see here 1, 2, 3 tables and a center tag, which I'm sure Shakib, if saw that in a regular page, would absolutely have a kitten. But the point here being is that this type of construct is what you're going to see. You're going to see directly called out styles, not CSS references, although some CSS references are acceptable. You'll see here class container for some browsers. But it's very difficult to write emails that are going to have the same behavior. So you'll see a lot of conditions on these. And that's driven off of what's supported by which email clients. So let's talk about that for a minute. I'm not an email expert. I'm trying to share with you what I know. And what I know is that there's a lot of people out there who know a lot more about it than I do. There are people who make their entire business off of this. Campaign Monitor is one of them. Campaign Monitor has actually published /CSS an entire listing of different clients and what individual CSS constructs will work with them. And you'll see right here, Outlook, no. I don't know how many people use AOL Mail, but this is just one tag. And there's a whole bunch of them listed in here. They've got a whole great listing of trying to determine which ones are which and which ones are supported where. MailChimp, also very big into the email space and the monitoring space for marketing purposes. They have a nice write-up here at this location that talks about email HTML versus web HTML, things to use, things not to use, things to avoid. They have this is just a small snippet of this page that goes on for quite some time with all these variances. If you are a person who is sending out marketing email, if part of your business is to send stuff external to a variety of clients, you might want to consider something like Litmus. Litmus is actually similar to Browser Stack, where you can actually take a look at how your website will look on multiple browsers. Litmus is for email testing, to where they will show you a whole series of email kickbacks. In fact, you'll see here for Apple Mail 12, dark mode is an option to see what your email is going to look like in dark mode, but also across a variety of different clients. And on that note, dark mode is a thing. I have seen emails come across on my own device. Like I said, I've become a very big fan of dark mode, that some of them translate just fine. You'll find the simpler emails will translate very well. When they start trying to add more complicated images or backgrounds, it starts to fail in some areas. There's a very nice nice article from Campaign Monitor that specifically talks about guides for writing emails in dark mode, how to deal with images, how to deal with background, because what you're getting is your font color is getting adjusted for you, whether you like it or not. And depending on what's behind it and how you laid it out is going to change how it's displayed on a device. So which devices are you worried about? So this is tied to Litmus, and they did an email client market share, and they publish this every month. This is 1 month's worth of data of something like 1.2 billion. Apparently the iPhone has a fairly large amount of market share. I was really expecting to see Samsung a little bit higher, but Gmail, as expected, is very high, and so is Outlook. At least here's the thing: you have to take your data with a grain of salt. This is probably from marketing emails and not your work email. Maybe not. Apple Mail, is still very high. So that does consume a lot of people who are on Macs. But I do know that Outlook is exclusive to my current employer. So the question comes, who are you trying to satisfy with your design? You're going to spend a lot of time designing this out. Are you trying to do mass out to everybody in the world? Are you trying to just do some of them because this is your primary audience? Or are you just kind of limited within your business to a single one, or maybe two, maybe a mobile device and the corporate email client? It depends. So you have to kind of decide. There's going to be a time and money investment from a development standpoint, and then a business value. If your business is marketing, you'll probably want to spend more time and money on this. You probably want to buy a service that does an evaluation for you to determine how your email is going to be done. If that email is being generated by Apex, there's a good chance that if your business value is very high for that, you're probably using a campaign generator anyways that's got all the pre-built templates or modifications to it. So you kind of have to decide where you fall on this curve. I'm going to continue on this conversation, assuming that professionals who are building things for specific audience kind of fall down into this, which is don't want to spend a ton of time on it, time which equals money, but it's going to have a much higher business value just by simply having it be there and look professional. So if that's your case, and that's the scenario you fall in, let me give you this little tip. If you like the basic Oracle Apex templates, great, go for it. If you have a requirement to build your own, it might be just as simple as opening up your preferred client, writing your email, putting hashtag substitutions on it. Send this to yourself and just look at the source code. Take that source code, convert it into something close to what you want for the email template. It doesn't have to be written all by hand. You'll find that when you do a decent layout here, that it's going to translate fine for the most of your stuff. Doing text version of that might just be a simple copy and paste of this piece of it. But that's an easy way to get to something that looks similar to your corporate layout. It doesn't have to be terribly complicated in that sense. So let's talk about one additional thing. We talked about the call to action being kind of important for your email generation, for the success of your messaging. You want to make sure that you're conscious of security. You can't talk about software these days without talking about security. And if you're going to be including links in your email, you're going to want to make sure that they are functional and that they are Apex capable. So here's some considerations for you. These aren't right and wrong answers. They're just things that you're going to have to learn how to solve. Links without security can create vulnerabilities. If you've put links into data on unauthenticated pages, that data should be classified as public. Now, if you're doing a shopping cart and you want to take them to a product, fair enough. If you are doing something to some type of PII, PHI, or HIPAA information, probably not going to want to include that in a direct link. You may notice that some of your bank or financial institutions or even medical places now, when they send out information, it doesn't contain anything more than you have a message someplace else. Here's how to get to your messages after you authenticate in, but we're just letting you know. But it has no specific information on that message. It is just an identifier or something to trigger you to go do a different action. If you're going to include links on it, make sure that they go to a security place. If it does have IDs and you're using some type of single sign-on, fair enough. Make sure that if someone's coming in, even if they're authenticated with an ID value, that you are able to confirm that data is for them. So there's not a lot of right and wrong that I can tell you, other than you want to kind of evaluate your email as if you had sent it to your worst enemy. Would they be able to do something with it? And if the answer is no, carry on. If they have some type of information in which they can actually do some damage with, you want to consider that being an issue. There is a community thread for trying to access Apex links without logging in that was used for, I wanted to include here just for completeness. There is a way to do page entry constructs on that. I disagree with the need for this. If you've got single sign-on worked on, it will mess with your sessions, and that's what you want to be careful with, because like any link, If you click on a link in an email, it will, if it doesn't have session state built into it, or if you haven't enabled rejoin session feature, look that one up. It will start your session over, and therefore any context you had in session will be gone. So be careful with that if that is the way you operate. Okay. Know your host. As it sounds easy, but turns out to be remarkably challenging. So if you are new to Apex, or you're standing up a new version of Apex and this hasn't been done for you, at some point in time, you're going to want to get to the internal workspace so that you can actually set up your mail, because it's not set up by default. Apex is not a mail server. Apex is a mail consumer and uses the SMTP side of it to send email out. So when you log into and you're not in runtime mode, you should be able to get into this, log into your internal workspace. And depending on your host, and in this case, this is the Oracle Autonomous Database, you'll notice this section is empty. We'll talk about that in a minute. You should get to something that looks like this. And in here will be a series of settings, one of which includes instance settings, and that will get you to a series of subtabs, one of which will be your email. From that email tab, you can configure your SMTP host, your send host, the port. Are you using authenticated user? Are you using SSL? And some key information here that I want to highlight, which is this default email from address. Well, and there is a maximum per workspace, which is kind of a throttle to make sure you don't have people abusing it. But this is the one I want to talk about next. And the reason why is because this is very critical to determine how your email is received. So this gets us down a pretty dark topic, and I start to lose my expertise other than to know that it needs to be handled. There are people who study this, or people who run mail servers, and this is their job. What I know is enough to be dangerous and to know that something needs to be adjusted. What it really comes down to is spoofing of email addresses a long time ago. So I'll tell you a little story very quickly. Back in 19-something, when I was younger, I was setting up my first HTMLDB instance, and I wanted to get it hooked up to a mail relay. So I went walking down the hall to talk to the guys in the back room and say, hey, I'd like a mail relay so I can send out email, and I heard you guys can help me out with the session value. I said, okay, here, use this one. Oh, okay, good, that's great. So I went back, put it into my fancy dancy HTMLDB session, and lo and behold, I could send emails. It was super, very powerful. Until one time I sent out an email and I had an address typed wrong. I was like, well, how did that go anywhere? That's not even right. So I tried it out. I was actually able to send email out on this SMTP relay with any address I wanted. It didn't matter the domain or otherwise, and it all went through. As you can imagine, that's kind of a no-no, and not really a good idea now. And if anyone has ever gotten junk mail that looked like it was from Citibank or any other financial institution of your choice, you can realize it's kind of a thing. So the point there being is that times have changed, and as people abuse whatever the said device is, countermeasures get put in place. And some of the things you need to be aware of is that email is not an over-the-wall thing anymore, and it's not a guarantee of delivery. It's almost like an interface agreement between two systems, and there's more and more authentication going in between those. Just as an analogy, the idea here is that when you receive something from another place that says, hey, this email came from pick your company, part of that receiving server will now go back and validate, okay, what server are you from? What company you're from? I'm going to go look that up. And it's going to use this sender policy framework or these domain-based message authentication or the other one that's the DKIRM. And it's going to verify as much as it can that that message is from the calling domain. Now, you would think that this is pretty standard stuff. At my current place, we also had an issue where a system was set up and running email just perfectly fine. And then we did a server upgrade and the machines got renamed. What we found out was that the mail server it was using was actually reporting the machine it was on, so that when the machine changed, it started sending out values with the new name. And therefore, our customers who were receiving it had put in exceptions or whitelisted those machines. But now that we did a server upgrade, all the invoices were getting rejected as spam. So it took a while to not only just figure it out, but then figure out how to use the relays properly. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more. How can you test this as a developer? How can you know? Well, let me give you a little bit of tip here. And again, tools and tips. There's this neat little site out here called Mail Tester. And you can actually take it. They'll give you a dummy email that's some crazy long thing at mailtest.com. And you can actually send your email to it from wherever you're expecting your host to be. It will take that information and evaluate it. It reviews the SPF, reviews the DMARC, the DKIM, and you can look all these up. And it will give you a score based on this. So I've got this nice little score of 7.6. I've had it as low as 4.3, depending on how I had my domain set up, because the system I was using or the mail relay I was using wasn't even set up correctly based on my host that I was tweaking. Obviously not my company stuff. This is more my personal stuff for this test. But it does a great job of not rejecting your stuff, but telling you why someone else might. So I truly appreciate this type of server. And they do have a paid service. They let you do 3 or so before they say, hey, you really kind of need to pay us. They used to let you do more. It is possible to actually get a perfect score. So one of my hosts I actually have configured properly and runs right through everything like the champ, except for the fact that my host didn't always get a 10. It recently got a 10, and I found out because it uses a load balanced mail server. And just happened to be the time when I ran this one, it showed up right. It was running server number 34. When I ran it before, it ran 33, and it got a different score. So my point on that is that you need to make sure that this type of testing has been done regularly and that you have a good network architecture. Most Apex developers aren't also, most, and I say most, some are, but not all Apex developers will be network architects either. Most corporations or larger companies, unless you're running it all yourself, are going to have a team that is their purpose. You need to know who that team is so that you can make sure that this type of thing works. They probably have a mail relay server that is externally facing, and you're going to want to make sure that your email, when sent through that server, is being tagged with that detail. So, long story short, when I was doing a test for this presentation, I wanted to show some email. And honestly, you've all seen email before. So at the end of the day, I cut a lot of the demo out because it really wasn't that interesting. My email client's going to look different than yours, but I wanted to give you the concepts to look for. And one of the things I came across is I went out to apex.oracle.com and I said, what would it look like if I send it from here? What's the score? What's this detail? And that's when I realized I never noticed this because I don't send a lot of emails out from apex.oracle.com, that the from address, regardless of what I put in through the API, this is from me to me, would get overwritten. And it would turn into this no reply at oracle.com. I said, well, why the devil is that? Well, the reason why is for the things I was just talking about. So I did a quick Google, well, hang on. So here's the thing that I've learned about Apex and Oracle in general, for the most part. They build tools that they use internally. And then they sell those tools to other people. And Apex is no different. If Apex has the ability to go in and they said, no, we're going to overwrite your from, there's a good chance you can too. Not always, but there's a good chance. So I did a little Google foo and I took a look out here to see what I could come across. And I don't want to sound like a ton of a fanboy for this gentleman here who does a lot of write-ups, but also this nice gentleman here who I had the pleasure of working with for a period of time. Did a great write-up, and he commented on it and said, there is a setting you can use, and I'm betting it's the same one they do, which is this Apex instance admin set parameter for an email from override. And this allows you to actually put in a setting that when you use the Apex API, it will replace whatever you had in for the from value with this new value. Now, I tested it on our internal system that we have at my current employer, and it works great. I like it. It does great, especially on our dev systems. It's not something I want to put in production because I want that to actually be settable, but for our development system, this is fantastic. Caveat on this is undocumented, unsupported, and subject to change. But I find this so valuable as a feature, I really hope it gets instituted, that it's worth mentioning. So if you have a development system, not production, that you're not too worried about support on, and this is something that you would need or want to test with, very useful. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Actually, it leads us right into the next topic. Do you SDLC? Everybody's going to have some type of process. The process you use is going to be dependent a lot on your infrastructure and your delivery demands. I'm going to keep one super simple. And right now, this is a standard dev, test, production lifecycle. So in Jeff's write-up, which I had the link to in the previous page, it was about this type of process. And in his process, it was, we have cloned backwards. And they've taken production and cloned it back so they could do additional tests. Now, this is going to depend on your structure. Is it Apex only infrastructure? Why would you do this if that was the case? It's probably that Apex was actually built in with some other type of tool, EBS or something else that they had extended on the same Oracle database. But when they clone it down, it comes with all the production information. So they have a post-clone script that kicks in after each one of these. And his case was deleting the email queue, making sure that the mail queue was empty, so that he didn't have stuff coming out of development and test instances that had production information in it. Fair enough. Very valid. The next follow-up question, though, is what do you do when you try to test one of these things in test or dev, and it's going to start sending out invoices to customers or to whomever the email is going out for from non-production systems? That's going to get kind of confusing. So this is not a right and wrong conversation, but things for you to take away and to think about. If you are doing some type of development cycle, one option for you to handle email is strictly to disable the email out of dev and test completely. Just kill them, dead. No issues, no errors. You will have a log. It'll build up. You can purge it. You can do whatever you want, but just remove the parameter for your SMTP server. It goes away. What's the con of that? Very difficult to test changes. So now you're dealing with trying to test your development changes kind of on a exception basis. If you enable the log, you want to make sure you purge it first so that things don't come out. But what if something comes out in between? A lot of considerations there, but that is one option for having clone backward instances. It's literally just to kill your mail capabilities out of that instance. Another option, instrument your code. Every package would have to have the ability to say, am I production? If so, then go. If I'm not production, then don't, or to send it to a special to field. It's possible you could put a wrapper around your entire API, which is what I actually had done at my company, somebody had done, was to actually put a whole wrapper around the API, and it looked up the parameter value for that instance to say, is this production or is this development? And if it's production, we'll go ahead and send it. If it's development, send it all to a dev box. The issue is that each application needs to be tweaked. You need to make sure they're all using the correct wrapper API. Clones and copies would need to be updated to make sure that those parameters are there, depending on what degree you set them to. And also, it doesn't necessarily apply to interactive reports. If they're doing the scheduling or anything like that, it won't. Your API call doesn't necessarily override the basic Apex one. So some pros and cons there. My preferred solution, which is in development at our place right now, so I don't have this working, but we've done some research on, and this is the direction we're going to try to go, is a new mail relay server. So this allows us to have a custom relay server that we just have to update the Apex session, the Apex instance setting for the mail relay, and simply say, nope, everything that goes here is going to the dead letterbox or to the development letterbox, and it all goes there. Nothing ever leaves because that system doesn't have the ability to send email externally. It can send it to a letterbox that we can then let people log into and see so they can do tests and development, but nothing will ever leave that server out to the outside world. This requires setting up a relay server that actually has some custom modification to it so that it does send it to an actual box that people can get to, but not leave with unset values. But this would apply to an entire instance. A better option for possibly a future crystal ball type of thing would be a feature request. a feature request that would allow the support of this type of behavior that could be set maybe at the instance level, maybe at the workspace level, maybe even at the application level, and have that parameter drive the behavior of the Apex Mail API. That would be solving the need for this type of thing. Right now, this is the direction we're going based on the current capabilities without having to modify the Apex Mail. We also looked at possibly doing a trigger on the Apex table, and that would be difficult, not difficult, but risky. So we chose not to do that. But this is kind of where we are from our standpoint, and some feedback and some considerations for the community. So on this thing, I'll wrap up with the last little bit here. If you haven't seen these, there was some discussion earlier. Dimitri did a whole series of, I don't know, what was like 20 blog posts on Oracle's autonomous transactional processing, ATP, Apex instance. Chaitanya here also did a setup, and these two are actually pretty similar. And there's the documentation officially, which basically takes their stuff, which is written very well, and turns it into Oracle documentation. The construct here is that this is all the same. If you do use their free ATP, which I did try to use, email is disabled by default, but can be turned on. But third-party mail suppliers are not allowed right now, so you have to run through Oracle's email. According to my notes, you had to be a paid subscriber to get into it. Now, I've heard that's only if you send 1,000 emails. I'm not going to risk it. So I don't have email set up on my ATP instance right now. I would love to see how to do that without being a paid subscriber, or to get some type of documentation that says only 1,000. If you have it, send it to me. I'd love to see it. But right now, if you're interested in using ATP to send it, there is extra steps here. And this has to do with those firewalls that they've moved some of the authentication back to prevent Oracle from getting hit with spam generation as Oracle servers being the source, and hence creating blacklists. They've really throttled down on what is allowed to be sent from their servers. Even if it does get sent, if you want it sent with your domain registration, you're going to have to do that other stuff we talked about, which is setting up your privilege from your domain to be able to be sent from those individual servers. All right. Additional email resources. If you haven't seen this, mail campaigns, creating mail. This was a blog post that was done recently. It was actually touted on Twitter a few times. Great stuff. It talks about the mail templates and how to cycle through a series of sign-up emails in order to send out those mail templates to the individuals who are interested. So that's really cool. It was another write-up of the same constructs that I was talking about in a little bit more detail. I am a Jeff Kemp fan. He does great write-ups on other things, and apparently in his travels, he's had to do several things, including Mailgun. So if you're interested in sending out mass emails using a third-party service, that's kind of fun. Adrian has done a while back a series of blog posts on how to set up the mail hosts and relays using Amazon. So good reading there if you're interested in that topic. Last I'll leave you with is this. Sometimes the best solution is to avoid the problem. Whoops, clicking too much. There are some services out here which I find terribly fascinating and would love an opportunity to actually mess with them. One of which is Mailinator, the other one is ClickSend. This one actually has, so all the stuff we've been talking about is sending mail. How to get mail from your system out. Mailinator actually provides a service, a REST-based service, not only for sending mail, but reading it. So you can actually get it back. So if you were to actually configure that, in theory, you could set up APIs via REST to actually read back responses. Bounce back is something we didn't talk about. You send a bunch of emails out. Part of what things like Campaign Monitor and MailChimp do is they keep track of which ones got returned. You'll never see that in Apex. Apex is out only one way, because that's how the SMTP host works. You have to monitor that response back to figure out whether or not that's being received. What if they hit reply? It goes actually to somebody else's box. You've got to manage all that. This actually is an API structure that you can actually, for what I thought was a fairly reasonable price, at least test that out. ClickSend also, SMS, big into SMS texting, messaging to do that piece. Definitely worth a look if you're interested in that. And again, apparently Jeff was on a project where he kind of lived and breathed this stuff for a little while. And wrote up most of his findings to share with the community. So there's my rundown. A bunch of information shared very quickly. Do we have any questions?
Hey, Tim. Thank you so much for this presentation. A lot of useful information for sure. We do have questions, and some of them you kind of touched a little bit, so let's start with that. Jose was asking earlier, can Apex receivers email response from a user and based on the contents of this message, execute a procedure in the database? For example, a use case could be manager replies to an email to approve an expense report.
Right now, the answer would be if you set up a routine to do it via one of the more advanced APIs, one of the util APIs or something like that, there is no built-in functionality right now for readback. That's one of the reasons why I found that last one so interesting, because it allowed you to do that processing. It is capable. There are services that do it. Help desk systems do it. Oracle Workflow does it. It is capable of being done, just not out of the box.
Yes, that's right. And Louis was actually asking a more general question. Is it possible from Apex to go and read an existing mailbox, potentially to do something similar as well? And as far as I know, I think there is no native functionality in Apex, but people have implemented this in PL SQL, and typically this requires some Java in the database as well.
That's the other option, yes. Java, I think Mr. Rice had done a read Java tool he had published some years back. But again, it has to keep up with the security constraints that go in, SSL changes and all of these things that you got to keep up with that.
Okay, so the next question was from Jose. And he was asking, can you handle different languages in the message body using the email templates in Apex?
That is an excellent question. Seeing that the way the templates are set up, the body content you give it can be a variable. You can translate that in whatever fashion before you, so the text does, so in the example that I gave where I said, write up your email, copy that out, put it into the template, no. If you wrote the template in a generic fashion where the language that was put in there was translatable, meaning that you had versions of it for each language, then yes.
Okay, thank you. And one more question about email templates from Juan. And he was asking, is there a substitution string in email templates that allows you to generate the multi-row table data? And maybe a more general question, is there a substitution string into which you maybe can pass a SQL cursor to get the result set, not just a single value?
To the best of my knowledge, not built. There's not a, here's a query, substitute that in here. You're going to probably have to build that offline as a session value that you can then use or pass in, because if that piece is in a PLSQL package, it can actually take, you can iterate through and create that value. You're going to want to wrap it with your proper HTML. So in the example that I had shown with the bullets in it, 1, 2, 3, you would end up taking just one of those lines, writing your cursor to where it appended those together, and then using that as the pass in for the list.
Okay, makes sense. And you talked about security and delivering email and things like that. Anonymous attendee was asking, is it possible from Apex to send encrypted email?
Is that a, I'm going to have to defer on that one. Vlad, do you, is that a feature of the SMTP host, or is that a feature of the request?
No, I think they're talking about encrypting the contents of the email, maybe using one of the technologies like S-MIME or something like that.
Yeah.
I
always thought that was a client-based technology.
Yeah. So I haven't heard about someone doing that. I would say maybe with util SMTP, maybe it's possible, but with Apex Mail API, which is a higher level wrapper on top of it, I'm guessing probably not. But that's a very reasonable request. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people would be interested to be able to do something like that. Okay, one more question from Malik. What is the best practice to place email templates? Should they be stored in a table or in Apex shared components?
So I didn't talk about this pro and con, but it is definitely an excellent question, because by having it in the application, just like with shared components, whether they be static files or otherwise, they are going to be released when the application is released. So it becomes part of that release cycle. So in order to make a revision to the email, you will have to release the app again. So when I mentioned before that we had done them separately, before we had implemented or even knew about templates, we had a big 5.1 implementation. And they had done the same type of template construct, but it's using CLOBs. So it has its own maintenance table. But then you have to do the substitutions. You walk through the template, you replace, when you see value X, you replace it with Y. The construct is the same, but it lives in its own CLOB. So the question comes, what is to evaluate that, how often do you change the message content? That is part of the template.
Okay, and from our experience, from our own experience, we talked about the therapeutic learning system that we recently implemented at Oracle. And in this case, we actually stored email templates in Apex shared components with the application, exactly for that reason, because first of all, the functionality is there. We don't need to re-implement it. And they get deployed, the changes get deployed with the application as well. And maybe one final question from Helen. And the question is, if we have files in the database, is it possible to email those files? For example, PDFs, for example.
Yes, depending on how you do it. Because attachments are possible. It's yes. You have to just have a decent architecture for it. It's part of the API.
All right, very good. And I think this is all the time we have. Again,
Yes.
Thank you, Tim, so much for your presentation.